Hi, my name's Kevin. I run the Bible Artist, and I don't know about you, but I was so excited by what I saw in the Chosen Season 5 trailer. And so I thought I would just go through some of the key images. I won't be rehashing some of the stuff from the teaser trailer because me and Victor went through that a couple weeks ago, or a couple months ago, actually. But there are some images that were really interesting here, and so I wanted to dive into some of my thoughts and theories about what we're going to see in the Chosen Season 5 as it is adapting Holy Week and the Last Supper. We start off here with Judas meeting with Caiaphas, the high priest. He's accompanied by Shmuel there in the background. And yeah, the really interesting line that Judas has is that he wants Caiaphas to know that he does actually think that Jesus could be the Messiah. And so Caiaphas quite reasonably asks, "Why are you handing him over then?" And Judas replies that he hasn't seen quite enough. And so this is a very interesting line. I don't think what Judas is saying is that he hasn't seen enough to believe that Jesus is really from God or that Jesus really has the ability to perform miracles or anything like that. Obviously, he's seen enough to know that. What I think he means when he says he hasn't seen enough is that he hasn't seen Jesus doing the things that he thinks Jesus should be doing. He thinks as the Messiah, Jesus should be being more aggressive in trying to kind of bring together a coalition that he can use to overthrow Rome and kind of reestablish Israel's glory. And so Judas is frustrated by how Jesus has kind of been pursuing his ministry. And I think what Judas is doing by betraying Jesus over to Caiaphas is he's kind of trying to force Jesus' hand. He's putting Jesus in a situation where it's kind of do or die. So if Judas thinks that as the Messiah, kind of Jesus's goal and his ultimate aim is to kind of reestablish a kingdom, if he forces Jesus into a corner where Jesus is potentially has his life threatened, then he thinks that Jesus will finally begin to act and be more decisive. But what Judas doesn't realize, of course, is that Jesus has a very different way of pursuing his aim of establishing his kingdom throughout the world. Instead of doing that through military victory and by kind of bringing together a coalition to conquer Rome and all the other countries, Jesus is, of course, going to die on the cross. And through his death on the cross, he will establish his rule throughout the world as people believe in him from all different nations. Judas doesn't understand that at this point, and so yeah, he's incidentally kind of allowing Jesus to accomplish Jesus's goal while kind of actually trying to oppose Jesus in other ways. So it's a really interesting scene. It's also interesting because in the Gospel of John, there's a distinction between believers who believe simply on the basis of what they can see versus those who go a little bit deeper and are able to believe in Jesus even when they can't see or even with regard to things that are kind of not earthly things. And I think Judas evoking how he hasn't seen enough kind of points to how he falls into that category of science faith that is based solely in what he can see, what he can perceive, what makes sense to him. And so that's an interesting theme that it seems like The Chosen is going to be pursuing this season. We move away from Judas. We get some scenes in the temple as he takes out his whip. He's challenging the temple authorities. I'm not going to go through all those different images that we get, but this one was really interesting to me because it looks like Atticus he's a real through line for this trailer. We see here that he is noticing what's going on with Jesus, and we're going to see later on in the trailer that he is actually trying to kind of prevent Jesus from walking into the trap that the Pharisees are plotting. So I think we're going to get a lot of Atticus, and I think he's going to play a very pivotal role in the season, even though he will ultimately not be fruitful in his efforts. Jesus, of course, he confronts the religious leaders. We've got Shmuel there. We've got Caiaphas. We've got, I think, Yusuf's there, maybe Yanni, some of the other Pharisees that we've met. And they are questioning Jesus, and one of them asks Jesus, by what authority do you do these things? So by what authority are you taking on the temple establishment? This is something that God has ordained, and so who are you to try to change things? And by what authority do you do that? And Jesus says, by my own authority. And that's one of the most kind of big statements about who Jesus is that Jesus has given throughout this entire show. By claiming to change things in the temple by his own authority, he really is kind of ascribing to himself a divine level authority, because yeah, you don't just change around the the things in the temple or the things in that are kind of these major institutions just on the basis of yourself. And so it points to Jesus's identity being something greater than, something just simply a prophet or a teacher. Later on, we see Jesus taking on the Pharisees. He's denouncing them, saying, "Woe to you, Pharisees, you brood of vipers," that kind of thing. And he specifically seems to be attacking Shmuel in this scene. And so it's kind of interesting because Jesus did try to kind of reach out to Shmuel towards the end of season 4, but he also challenged Shmuel because he could sense that there was something in Shmuel's heart that was kind of resisting. And so he kind of probed that. And then Shmuel obviously ultimately ended up rejecting Jesus at the end of season 4. And now we see Jesus kind of coming at him pretty hard. And Shmuel seems really conflicted in this image. Like, he doesn't just look angry or, abrasive or anything like that. He seems like he's really torn up, because we've noticed in season 4 how he's not totally on board with how things are going in the Sanhedrin with the other Pharisees. He's seeing some of the corruption there. And he also is seeing some of the truth of what Jesus is able to do. And so he obviously feels conflicted, even though later on in the trailer, he claims that Jesus isn't the Messiah. It kind of feels like when he says that, he's protesting a little too much, that he's kind of trying to resist what he actually knows inside his own heart. So I feel like Shmuel is going to have a really interesting arc in season 5 as well. We also get Jesus approaching Jerusalem, and as he approaches, he encounters, I believe this is a Sadducee. Yusuf is there behind him, and the Sadducee basically says, by declaring yourself a sovereign, you're going to bring Rome down on all of us. And that is the real fear that is driving Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin when they are trying to lock Jesus up. They fear that by kind of taking on kingship or allowing people to think that he's the Messiah, Jesus is really going to provoke a response from Rome. And so he warns of that. And then we transition straight to Romans attacking people, which, is reminding us like, oh yeah, Rome could start to get more aggressive because of Jesus. Although I think this scene, which is Atticus beating some people up after busting in a door, my guess is that this is a scene of Atticus raiding some zealots in Rome. I think that, or not in Rome, in Jerusalem, because I think we're going to get a contrast between Jesus, who is not a violent revolutionary, but I think to kind of highlight that, they'll probably give us some violent revolutionary activity from the zealots, and maybe even we'll get to see some build up for characters like Barabbas, who is going to come in next season, or even the thieves on the cross potentially be zealots based on what we're told about them. Got that. And then we see really kind of the ultimate end of what could happen if Rome decides to take on Jerusalem. So we see several very impressive shots of Jerusalem on fire. There's Romans, they're fighting some zealots there. So this is a scene that is a flash forward to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which happened after around 66 AD. The Zealots kind of led a revolution against Roman oppression. And for a little bit, they were doing kind of okay, but then Rome came down on them hard. They surround Jerusalem. They set things on fire. They destroy the temple. They slaughter lots and lots of people. And so we're going to get some sort of scene from that. And that makes a lot of sense because Jesus actually prophesies how that's going to happen. That he warns people because they're rejecting him as king and his peaceful way of kingship, ultimately they're going to end up taking on the other type of king. Now, not necessarily like a literal Messiah, but they're going to try to go the other approach of violent revolution against Rome instead of kind of taking the Jesus approach. And because they take that violent approach, that is ultimately going to bring on the destruction of Jerusalem here. And so it's kind of ironic, the people who are arresting Jesus because they're afraid that he's going to bring Roman oppression down on Jerusalem and bring destruction ultimately. Actually, by rejecting Jesus, they are setting themselves on the course that will ultimately actually lead to the destruction of Jerusalem. Because without Jesus to follow, the people are ultimately going to go after kind of more violent, zealot-like leaders who will lead them in that destructive path. Here we've got some disciples. This is during the Last Supper, kind of early in the supper before it turns to night, and they see some Roman soldiers marching through the streets. So this kind of transitions us. We've seen the threat of Rome to Jerusalem itself, but now we see kind of the threat of Rome to Jesus and the disciples. And so, there's this sense of kind of fear, and are they coming for us? So that'll be an interesting thing to see. Here we get another scene of Jesus in the temple. I selected this one. I thought it was interesting because of this woman here that's behind Jesus. I think she may be one of the Gentiles that Jesus encountered near the Decapolis towards the end of season 3. And she, initially was a little antagonistic towards Jesus and his disciples, but then he did the whole feeding of the 5,000 thing, and she was kind of rejoicing at that and very impressed by it. And so I think she will be one of the Gentiles that approaches Jesus during this kind of week of Holy Week, and she will be kind of seeking him out. And she goes to Philip and Andrew because they spent some time in the Decapolis. And so, I think she will be included there. I think she may also be relevant because one of Jesus's problems with the temple establishment is because they have all these different sales booths and money traders and things going on within the temple grounds. There's less room for the Gentiles to be worshiping God, because this outer court that all that stuff was happening in, it was supposed to be a court where the Gentiles could come to worship God. And so they're kind of getting crowded out by more kind of commercial activity. And so that's one of Jesus's problems with the temple establishment. So I think she may be involved in that whole situation. Here we get a quick shot of Pilate encountering Caiaphas, complaining to him, saying, don't do this. It seems like he's referring to kind of pursuing a prosecution against Jesus. So Pilate has found out from Atticus, and now Pilate is going to Caiaphas and trying to prevent it because he knows that it could be politically explosive. He knows that it could stir up dissent within the city, and Pilate just wants things to be calm and peaceful, but he can't take on Caiaphas face to face. And so this is really setting up for the confrontation that we will get when Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin bring Jesus to Pilate's house for judgment, where Pilate, he doesn't want to come down on Jesus because he knows that Jesus is popular with the people. He also knows that, Jesus is innocent. His wife, Claudia, is getting dreams about how he should not condemn Jesus. And so he is trying to kind of head that off in this scene. It's something that they came up with, but I think it provides a lot of interesting context to what we do get within the scriptural story. Here we get a quick shot of Jesus in what I presume is the Garden of Gethsemane. So this will probably be towards the very, very end of season 5. We will see him praying, not my will, but yours be done, asking the disciples to pray that they may not enter into temptation. I'm guessing that we will kind of end the season with Judas approaching with a band of soldiers and Jesus kind of sensing them coming, or maybe we may end right as they arrive to arrest him. Here's another scene that I was really interested by. So we have these soldiers, or I don't know who exactly they are. They are pulling this cart. They have their heads covered in hoods. The cart is covered. It's kind of mysterious what exactly is in the cart. But then we get this scene here, which I think is probably from the same scene, this shot here. And it looks like it's someone who's got a hood over their head, not a hood that you pull over just because you're traveling, but almost like an executioner's hood or something. So this seems to be some sort of prisoner. And so I'm very curious who he could be. Maybe he is a zealot who has been captured and is going to get brought in to face charges. I don't think this is Jesus because we aren't probably going to get to that point in the story. And so, a lot of mystery as far as who the mystery prisoner is. Here we've got Jesus having dinner with some of the female disciples, and this scene is interesting because we've noted, if you looked at some of the images of the Last Supper, it's just the 12 male disciples. We don't have Mother Mary there. We don't have Tamar and some of the Mary Magdalene, Mary and Martha, Joanna, any of those characters. And so it looks like Jesus kind of has a penultimate supper, and so he's eating with them, and he's basically warning them, there's going to be some really tough stuff happening in Jerusalem, and so I want you to keep your distance from me. And that is basically going to allow them later on when Jesus gets arrested and crucified, the female disciples are going to be the ones the Gospels tell us that were actually able to be present during the crucifixion. And it appears that the show is explaining that as being possible because they weren't very present with Jesus kind of throughout the actual Holy Week. So some of Jesus' enemies were not as aware of them. They weren't kind of marked as like problem people. And so they were able to accompany him at the moment of crucifixion. And also, Jesus is just being protective of his mother and the women in his life as well. Here we see kind of one of the dangers that might be faced by some of the female disciples kind of highlighted by this quick shot that we get of a man kind of coming up behind Mary Magdalene, putting his hand over her face. I can't recognize this man. It looked like he might potentially be the watcher from outside of Lazarus's tomb that we got in season 4, episode 7. And so I can't tell in the scene whether he is grabbing Mary and covering her mouth to try to get her, like kidnap her. That's definitely one possibility if he's kind of, maybe some of Jesus' enemies are trying to intimidate the women. Or I think maybe slightly more likely, I think this guy is a friend, and maybe Mary is kind of walking into a potential trap, or maybe some people are after her, and so he's trying to kind of quiet her so she doesn't give herself away. And he's maybe trying to remove her to a safer place. I think it's possible that this is John Mark, and that we'll kind of get introduced to him during the season, but we'll have to wait to see more about him. Here we've got a quick shot of Jesus and John, and I thought this was interesting because the Gospel of John tells us that Jesus and John had a very special relationship, and we got a little bit of that in season 2, episode 1, the whole beloved disciple episode, which I really enjoyed, but we haven't seen as much of it recently, and so I like that they are reminding us of that close connection between Jesus and John. It seems like Jesus is comforting John, showing him some love, which makes sense because he comes to be known as the beloved disciple. And we also see in some of the images that John is sitting right next to Jesus during the Last Supper, which is a spot of very great privilege within the Gospel of John. Jesus' spot next to Jesus John's spot next to Jesus allows him to ask Jesus some questions. And so, I'm interested what we're going to see here with this scene kind of between John and Jesus. It looks like we're going to get a lot of like very personal scenes that are drawing on some of the built storylines and emotional arcs that we've got between some of these different characters. And so I'm all in for that. And I think that's my last shot that I'm going to be looking at today. There were many others that I could have looked at, but I thought these were some of the most interesting ones. Maybe I'll look at some more stuff with Victor when we meet next time. But for now, that's my discussion of the Chosen Season 5 trailer. Thanks for joining me. Godspeed.